The advertisement in the Boston Herald promised a new life out west. Sarah Mitchell held the newspaper with trembling fingers, reading the words for the 100th time. Respectable businessman seeks wife for partnership in prosperous Dakota Territory enterprise. She had written 3 letters before receiving a response from Thomas Garrett, a man who claimed to own a successful trading post near Fort Pierre. At 23, Sarah had few options left. Her parents had died of influenza 2 years earlier, leaving her with debts she could never repay on a seamstress's wages. The boarding house where she rented a cramped room was raising prices again, and her landlady had made it clear that young women who couldn't pay found themselves on the street. Marriage to a stranger seemed less frightening than the alternatives Boston offered. Thomas's letters arrived weekly, each one more persuasive than the last. He described a comfortable home, a thriving business, and a community that would welcome her. He sent money for her passage and a daguerreotype showing a handsome man with kind eyes standing before a well-built structure. Sarah studied that photograph until she had memorized every detail, trying to convince herself that this man would be her salvation. The journey west took 3 brutal weeks. Sarah traveled by train to Omaha, then joined a wagon convoy heading into the Dakota Territory. The other travelers eyed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion when she explained she was meeting her husband-to-be. One elderly woman warned her that the frontier changed men, made them hard and sometimes cruel. Sarah smiled politely and looked away, refusing to let doubt take root. When she finally arrived at Fort Pierre in late September, the landscape shocked her. The endless prairie stretched in every direction, brown grass bending under a wind that never seemed to stop. The town itself was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of rough buildings huddled together as if seeking protection from the vast emptiness surrounding them. Thomas Garrett met her at the fort's entrance, and Sarah's heart sank immediately. The man before her bore little resemblance to the photograph. He was older, his face weathered and marked by drink. His eyes, which had seemed kind in the picture, were cold and calculating as they assessed her like livestock at auction. "You'll do," he said, reaching for her bag without introduction or greeting. "We'll get married tomorrow. The preacher's expecting us." That night, locked in a storage room above what Thomas called his trading post, Sarah discovered the truth. The business was little more than a failing whiskey shop that sold rotgut alcohol to soldiers and trappers. The comfortable home didn't exist. Thomas lived in 2 filthy rooms behind his establishment, and he made it clear she would be working to help pay off his considerable debts. But the worst revelation came when she tried the door and found it bolted from the outside. Through the thin walls, she heard Thomas talking with another man, discussing her as if she were property he had purchased. He laughed about the photograph he had borrowed from a cousin back east, boasted about how easy it was to trick desperate women into coming west where they had no family, no money, and no way to escape. Sarah sat on the floor in the darkness, understanding fully what she had done. She had traveled 2,000 miles to become a prisoner. Tomorrow she would be married to a man who saw her as an investment, a source of labor to exploit. The law would give him complete control over her life, her body, and any wages she might earn. She thought about her parents, grateful they hadn't lived to see this day. She thought about Boston and wondered if starving on the streets might have been preferable to this trap. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Sarah made herself a promise. She would survive this. Somehow, some way, she would find her freedom. She just had to stay alive long enough to discover how. The wedding ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. The preacher, a tired-looking man who smelled of whiskey, mumbled through the vows while Thomas gripped Sarah's arm hard enough to leave bruises. When it was done, Thomas handed the man $2 and dragged his new wife back to the trading post without a word of celebration or acknowledgement. Sarah's duties began immediately. She was to clean the establishment, serve customers, cook meals, and wash clothes. Thomas explained the rules in a voice devoid of warmth. She would not leave the building without his permission. She would not speak to customers unless necessary for business. Any money she touched belonged to him, and if he suspected her of stealing even a penny, the consequences would be severe. The first week passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. The trading post attracted the worst elements of frontier society. Drunken soldiers stumbled in at all hours, their eyes following Sarah with unmistakable hunger. Trappers and traders haggled aggressively over goods, some deliberately trying to provoke Thomas into fights. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, and the floor was perpetually sticky with spilled alcohol. Thomas proved to be even crueler than Sarah had feared. He rationed her food, claiming she needed to earn her keep before she could eat properly. He criticized everything she did, finding fault with her cleaning, her cooking, and her appearance. When she was too slow serving customers, he would grab her roughly and shove her toward the bar. When she spoke without being spoken to, he would slap her across the face. But Thomas's greatest weapon was isolation. He made sure Sarah understood that she had nowhere to go. The nearest town of any size was over 100 miles away. She had no money, no friends, and no family who knew where she was. The few women in Fort Pierre were wives of soldiers or officers, and they looked down upon her as the property of a whiskey peddler. Even if she tried to seek help, who would listen to her complaints about her legal husband? 3 weeks after her arrival, Sarah met Blue Hawk Woman. The Lakota woman came to the trading post to exchange buffalo hides for flour and sugar. She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. While Thomas haggled over the price of the hides, Blue Hawk Woman watched Sarah, noting the bruises on her arms and the way she flinched when Thomas moved too quickly. When the transaction was complete, Blue Hawk Woman spoke directly to Sarah in careful English. "You are not well treated." It wasn't a question. Before Sarah could respond, Thomas stepped between them, his face flushing with anger. "Get back to the kitchen. Now." He turned to Blue Hawk Woman with false politeness. "My wife is not accustomed to dealing with Indians. I hope you'll forgive her rudeness." Blue Hawk Woman's expression didn't change. She gathered her goods and left without another word, but Sarah felt the weight of that brief encounter. Someone had seen her suffering. Someone had acknowledged it. The incident enraged Thomas. That night, he accused Sarah of embarrassing him in front of a customer. His hand connected with her cheek so hard that she tasted blood. "You exist to make me money, nothing more," he hissed. "The sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." Sarah lay awake that night, listening to Thomas snore in the next room. She touched her swollen face and thought about Blue Hawk Woman's words. The Lakota woman had spoken with such directness, such authority. She hadn't looked at Sarah with pity but with recognition, as if seeing a fellow person trapped in circumstances beyond her control. As October turned to November, the weather grew colder. Sarah had only the thin dresses she had brought from Boston, inadequate for the brutal Dakota winter approaching. Thomas refused to buy her warmer clothing, claiming she should have prepared better. She began to suffer from constant chills, and a cough developed that kept her awake at night. The customers grew fewer as the weather worsened, which only made Thomas more volatile. He drank more heavily, his mood swinging between sullen silence and explosive rage. Sarah learned to anticipate his movements, to make herself small and invisible whenever possible. She became a ghost in her own life, existing only to serve and avoid punishment. But something else was happening too. Through the trading post window, Sarah began to notice the Lakota people who occasionally passed through the area. They moved with a freedom she had never known, even back in Boston. Despite the hardships they obviously faced, despite the encroachment of settlements and the tensions with the military, they carried themselves with dignity. She found herself watching them with something between envy and hope, wondering what kind of society produced people like Blue Hawk Woman who could look at suffering and name it so clearly. Winter descended on the Dakota Territory with savage intensity. Snow piled against the trading post walls, and the wind howled through gaps in the poorly constructed building. Sarah's cough worsened, becoming a deep, rattling sound that made her chest ache with every breath. Thomas ignored her illness, instead complaining that her constant coughing disturbed his sleep and annoyed customers. December brought a new horror. A group of trappers arrived at the post, men who had been in the wilderness for months. They had money from selling their furs and a desperate hunger for whiskey and entertainment. Thomas served them generously, encouraging them to drink more, spend more, stay longer. Sarah tried to remain in the kitchen, but Thomas ordered her to serve the men personally. The trappers made crude comments as she moved between tables, their hands reaching out to touch her skirt, her arm, her hair. Sarah endured it silently, knowing that any complaint to Thomas would be futile. He was too busy counting their money to care about her dignity or safety. On the third night of their stay, the largest of the trappers, a man called Red Jack, cornered Sarah in the storage room. His breath was hot and reeking of alcohol as he pushed her against the wall. "Your husband won't mind sharing," he slurred, his hands grabbing at her waist. Sarah screamed and fought, scratching at his face with her nails. The commotion brought Thomas running, but not to rescue her. He pulled Red Jack away only because he feared losing the man's business. "Not without paying," Thomas said, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. Red Jack laughed and reached for his purse. Thomas named a price. They were negotiating over her as if she were goods for sale. Something broke inside Sarah at that moment. All the fear, all the careful survival strategies, all the desperate hope that somehow things might improve, it all shattered. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the shelf and swung it with all her remaining strength at Red Jack's head. The man crumpled, blood streaming from a gash above his ear. The room fell silent. Thomas stared at her with shock that quickly transformed into rage. "You've killed him. You've murdered my customer." Red Jack groaned, proving he was very much alive, but Thomas's fury was already unleashed. He lunged at Sarah, his hands reaching for her throat. She dodged and ran, throwing herself toward the door. Behind her, she heard Thomas shouting, heard the other trappers stirring from their drunken stupor. Sarah burst out into the December night wearing only her thin dress. The cold struck her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Snow was falling heavily, and the wind cut through the fabric as if she wore nothing at all. She had no plan, no destination, only the overwhelming need to escape. She ran blindly into the darkness, away from the trading post, away from the sound of Thomas bellowing her name. Her feet, covered only in house slippers, quickly went numb in the snow. The wind drove icy particles into her face, making it hard to see or breathe. Within minutes, she was completely disoriented, unable to tell which direction she had come from or where she was going. Sarah stumbled and fell, her hands plunging into deep snow. She struggled to stand, but her dress had become soaked and heavy, weighing her down. The cold was everywhere now, seeping into her bones, slowing her thoughts. She managed to get to her feet and stagger forward a few more steps before falling again. This time, getting up seemed impossible. Her body was shutting down, the cold overwhelming her ability to function. She thought dimly that this was how she would die, frozen in the Dakota snow, and perhaps it was better than the alternative. At least Thomas wouldn't have the satisfaction of killing her himself. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling strangely peaceful despite the cold. She thought of her parents, hoped they would forgive her for the choices that had brought her to this end. The wind's howl faded to a distant sound, and she felt herself drifting away. Then there were voices, speaking in a language she didn't understand. Strong hands lifted her from the snow. Sarah tried to open her eyes but couldn't manage it. She felt herself being wrapped in something warm, felt the movement of being carried. She wanted to ask who had found her, wanted to know if she was being taken back to Thomas, but her frozen lips couldn't form words. The last thing she remembered before consciousness left her completely was the sensation of warmth and the sound of a deep voice speaking calmly in Lakota, the words incomprehensible but somehow comforting in the endless cold darkness. Sarah woke to warmth and the smell of wood smoke. She lay on soft buffalo robes in a structure made of poles and hides, a traditional Lakota teepee. Her wet clothes had been removed and replaced with a dress of tan deerskin. Her feet, wrapped in thick fur, throbbed painfully as sensation returned to them. Blue Hawk Woman sat nearby, tending a small fire. When she saw Sarah's eyes open, she offered a cup of warm broth. "Drink slowly," she said in English. "You nearly died in the snow." Sarah's hands shook as she took the cup. "How did you find me?" "My nephew was returning from hunting when he saw you fall. He brought you to our winter camp." Blue Hawk Woman's expression was serious. "The whiskey seller came looking for you. He stood at the edge of our camp, shouting that you are his wife, his property. Our chief sent him away." "He'll come back," Sarah whispered, fear flooding through her renewed warmth. "The law says I belong to him. He can force me to return." "White man's law," Blue Hawk Woman said. "Here, you are under our protection. Drink your broth and rest. Tomorrow you will meet Charging Bear, our chief. He will decide what happens next." Sarah spent a fitful night, her dreams haunted by Thomas's face and Red Jack's reaching hands. She woke several times in panic, convinced she was back in the trading post, only to find herself safe in the teepee's warmth. Blue Hawk Woman slept nearby, a reassuring presence in the darkness. Morning brought bright sunlight reflecting off snow. Blue Hawk Woman helped Sarah dress in warm clothing and led her through the winter camp. Sarah saw 20 teepees arranged in a circle, smoke rising from their tops. People moved about their morning tasks, pausing to look at the white woman with curiosity but not hostility. Charging Bear's teepee was larger than the others, positioned prominently within the circle. Blue Hawk Woman announced their arrival in Lakota, and a deep voice invited them to enter. Sarah had never seen a man like Charging Bear. He was perhaps 35, tall and powerfully built, with a presence that commanded immediate respect. His face was strong and intelligent, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He wore his hair in 2 long braids decorated with eagle feathers, and his buckskin clothing was beautifully crafted with intricate beadwork. But it was his eyes that struck Sarah most forcefully. They were dark and intense, yet filled with a warmth and wisdom that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced. When he looked at her, he didn't see property or a servant or something to be used. he saw a person. Charging Bear spoke in Lakota, and Blue Hawk Woman translated. He says you are welcome in our camp. He asks why you ran into the killing cold. Sarah found her voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. My husband was going to sell me to a trapper. I couldn't endure it anymore. I would rather have died in the snow than go back to that life. Blue Hawk Woman translated, and Charging Bear's expression darkened. He spoke at length, his voice growing more forceful. Charging Bear says this is not a true marriage, Blue Hawk Woman explained. Among our people, a woman cannot be forced into marriage or treated as property. A marriage where there is no respect, no honor, is no marriage at all. He says you are free here. The whiskey seller has no power in this place. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. But he'll go to the soldiers at the fort. They'll make me return to him. Charging Bear listened to the translation, then spoke again, his words measured and firm. Charging Bear says let them try. He is a chief of the Lakota people, and while his nation faces many troubles with the whites, he still has authority over his own camp. You have asked for protection, and he grants it. You are now under his care. The next weeks passed like a dream. Sarah slowly recovered from her ordeal, her frost-bitten feet healing gradually under Blue Hawk Woman's expert care. She learned that Charging Bear was a respected leader trying to guide his people through impossible times. The government wanted the Lakota confined to reservations, their traditional way of life destroyed. Charging Bear had been fighting to preserve his people's freedom and dignity in the face of overwhelming pressure. Despite his burdens, Charging Bear took an interest in Sarah's welfare. He visited daily, sometimes bringing food, sometimes simply sitting and talking through Blue Hawk Woman's translations. He asked about her life in Boston, her journey west, her dreams for the future. He listened with genuine attention, offering perspectives that showed both wisdom and deep thought. Sarah found herself drawn to him in ways that confused and frightened her. After Thomas's cruelty, she had believed herself incapable of trusting any man again. But Charging Bear was different. He treated her with respect, never touching her without permission, never raising his voice in anger. February brought a thaw, and with it, the confrontation Sarah had been dreading. Thomas arrived at the Lakota camp with 3 soldiers from Fort Pierre. He stood at the edge of the circle of teepees, shouting demands. That woman is my legal wife. You're harboring stolen property. I want her returned immediately. Charging Bear emerged from his teepee and walked calmly to meet them. Sarah watched from Blue Hawk Woman's dwelling, her heart pounding with fear. The chief and the soldiers spoke for several minutes, their voices carrying across the camp. Blue Hawk Woman stood beside Sarah, translating what she could hear. Charging Bear tells them you came to us seeking protection from violence. He asks the soldiers if white law allows a man to sell his wife to other men. The soldiers look uncomfortable. They say they cannot interfere in a lawful marriage. Thomas was grinning now, sensing victory. But Charging Bear wasn't finished speaking. He gestured toward the teepee where Sarah stood, and his voice rose with authority and passion. Charging Bear tells them you are under the protection of the Lakota Nation. He says if they try to take you by force, it will be seen as an act of war against his people. He reminds them that there have been enough battles between the Lakota and the whites. Does the army really want to fight over one woman who seeks only safety from a cruel man? The soldiers shifted uneasily, clearly unwilling to escalate the situation. They spoke in low voices with Thomas, whose face was turning red with rage. Finally, the ranking soldier addressed Charging Bear again. They say they will report this to their commander. They will not remove you by force today, but this matter is not settled. Blue Hawk Woman's voice was tense. They are leaving, but Thomas is very angry. This is not over. As the soldiers and Thomas departed, Charging Bear returned to where Sarah stood. He spoke to her directly, waiting for Blue Hawk Woman to translate. You are safe for now, but we must find a permanent solution. I have a proposal for you to consider. That evening, Charging Bear explained his plan. If Sarah agreed, he would formally adopt her into his tribe. This would give her legal standing as a Lakota person rather than a white woman subject to white laws. It wouldn't be recognized by the American government, but it would strengthen his claim to protect her and make it more politically difficult for the soldiers to intervene. There is another option, Charging Bear said, his eyes meeting Sarah's with an intensity that made her breath catch. Among my people, a woman can choose her husband. If you were to marry me, willingly and of your own choice, you would be fully protected. No one could claim you as another man's property. Sarah stared at him, shocked. You would marry me? But why? I bring you nothing but trouble with the soldiers and the government. Charging Bear smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. You bring yourself. That is enough. He grew more serious. I will be honest with you, Sarah. My life is not easy. I lead a people facing destruction of everything we have known. Our land is being taken, our way of life attacked from all sides. I cannot promise you comfort or safety in the years ahead. But I can promise you respect, partnership, and freedom to be your own person. Blue Hawk Woman spoke up, her voice gentle. Among our people, marriage is different from what you have known. A wife is not property but a partner. She has rights, including the right to leave a marriage if she is unhappy. Charging Bear would never treat you as the whiskey seller did. Sarah looked at this man who had saved her life, who had risked conflict with the military to protect her, who now offered her not just safety but genuine partnership. She thought about the person she had been in Boston, desperate, trapped by poverty and limited options. She thought about the nightmare she had endured with Thomas. And she thought about the person she might become here, among people who valued freedom and dignity. I accept, she said quietly. Not because I have no other choice, but because I choose this. I choose you. The marriage ceremony took place 3 days later, conducted according to Lakota tradition. Sarah and Charging Bear stood before the assembled tribe, speaking their vows with Blue Hawk Woman translating. They exchanged gifts. Charging Bear gave Sarah a beautifully beaded dress that had belonged to his mother, and Sarah gave him a blanket she had woven with Blue Hawk Woman's patient instruction. The ceremony was nothing like her wedding to Thomas. There was joy here, celebration, a genuine coming together of two people choosing each other freely. When Charging Bear took her hand, his touch was gentle and respectful. When he looked at her, she saw partnership and possibility. The months that followed were difficult but filled with purpose. Sarah learned the Lakota language, adopted their customs, and found her place within the tribe. She discovered skills she had never known she possessed, tanning hides, preserving food, creating beautiful beadwork. More importantly, she discovered strength she hadn't known existed within herself. Charging Bear proved to be everything he had promised. He treated her as an equal partner, seeking her counsel on important decisions, respecting her opinions even when they disagreed. Their relationship grew deeper as they faced challenges together. Negotiations with the government, tensions with settlers, the constant struggle to preserve their way of life. Thomas tried once more to reclaim her, arriving drunk at the camp with threats and demands. Charging Bear handled him calmly but firmly, making it clear that Sarah was beyond his reach. When Thomas persisted, some of the younger warriors escorted him forcefully to the edge of Lakota territory with a warning never to return. He was later found dead from exposure after a drunken fall, and Sarah felt nothing but relief at the news. 2 years after that desperate flight into the snow, Sarah stood outside her teepee, watching the sun rise over the prairie. She wore traditional Lakota dress, her hair braided in the style of married women. Her hands rested on her swollen belly, feeling the child moving within her. Charging Bear emerged from the teepee and stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Do you have regrets?" he asked in Lakota, a language she now spoke fluently. Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought about everything she had lost, her old life, her certainty about who she was, the familiar comforts of civilization. She thought about everything she had gained, freedom, dignity, genuine love, a community that valued her. She thought about the woman she had been, desperate and trapped, and the woman she had become, strong and free. "No regrets," she answered, leaning into his warmth. "My nightmare ended the day I met you. Everything since then has been the life I was always meant to live."